This is part two of my whistleblower statements to the press. I ended by telling you about Jasna Singh wrongfully admitting me to ECMC. For multiple reasons, they were profiting heavily from basically wrongfully committing people to ECMC for months. In fact, there was another investigator that was already up there. He was Marine Special Forces. He was a veteran, and he said that they are they're wrongfully committing people to ECMC. He said they got 4 floors and 4 wings on each floor, and he said they're fraudulently billing both Department of Defense on behalf of veterans and People's Insurance $500 million, about $500 million a year. That also includes keeping people up there, saying that they can't discharge them because they're homeless, and then getting them fraudulently qualified for HUD housing. Now, there was a lot of people that went in there and got discharged right on out to the streets who were really, truly, they really, truly had some sort of mental illness that made them completely incapacitated and completely unable to care for themselves, where they could not hold a job. The people that they were getting the apartments for were participating in those scams so they could get their benefits. They were openly trying to get that crazy check, trying to get themselves an apartment, and then many of them were addicts. They were getting Suboxone, methadone. So they had there was some other payoff for them to go ahead and participate in these scams. They didn't really have, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on addicts or alcoholics. I'm just saying they had something else going on where they were not interested in a career making more than $600 or $700 or $800 a month that you get with SSI. They weren't interested in, having a nice apartment, an upscale apartment. They were out to get whatever they could get. And I'm not saying that they didn't deserve it, but I'm saying that they were allowing these doctors to fraudulently keep them up there and use these false diagnoses and falsified medical records to get them as many benefits as they could. And then while other people who really needed housing and really shouldn't have been on the streets and weren't abusing drugs, they weren't doing any, they just had a mental illness, they were being refused care and they were getting discharged from ECMC. I said, what is you got to have, before somebody's going to act out in such a way that they are a harm to themselves or others, they've got to have a diagnosis. And I said, I recorded all of it, and I kept demanding to know what the diagnosis was. Nobody would give me a diagnosis. Finally, one of the nurses went in and said that they diagnosed you with schizoaffective disorder. And I said she couldn't make that diagnosis in 90 seconds. And I reported the fraud every second of every day. I immediately asked for risk management. I demanded to speak to supervisors. I demanded to speak with house supervisors, and they refused. It started at Buffalo General Medical Center. I went into Buffalo General Medical Center at the behest of my primary care doctor at Catholic Health. When I first got to New York, I had left Orlando. I realized that there was some tampering going on. I'm not going to go into it because I don't want to get anybody killed down there, but I realized that there was a really good chance that Chad wasn't dead, that obituary was fake, that he was sequestered. I'm the one that sent the email suggesting the Mizzou football player strike. It went to Chad, the NAACP, and several people at Mizzou. And while that protest was going on that was getting international coverage, they tried to kill me in front of a Columbia police detective. She wasn't a peace officer. She investigated victim tampering. Um, she specialized in domestic violence, and I was being murdered because of domestic violence because of the attorney that I worked for, Chad Cronin, and I had had it wasn't a full blown affair, but we were intimate and we were definitely speaking at the sexual level with a primary care provider, my nurse practitioner at Family Health Center of Boone County, which was a University of Missouri teaching facility where the Missouri Health Net director was on staff. Well, he wasn't just on staff there as the chief psychiatrist. He was also on staff at the University of Missouri. He was a psychiatric professor, and he was appointed by Governor Jay Nixon, Democrat Governor Jay Nixon, part of Hillary Clinton's camp. He fired the previous Health Net director and moved Joe Parks, who was the medical director for the Department of Mental Health there in Missouri, and moved him over as the Health Net director to make sure there was no oversight on Medicaid fraud. And all of my recordings from Family Health Center and the University of Missouri and BJC Healthcare absolutely implicate him and ultimately Governor Jay Nixon in healthcare fraud. And they were partnered with Catholic Health, specifically SSM St. Mary's. That same police detective who witnessed the attempt against my life while the Missouri protests were ongoing had also taken me to 40 minutes out of town to a SSM St. Mary's Catholic Health GYN oncologist named Dr. Clark Andelin, who told us he was doing a DNC biopsy. Instead, he did an ablation, didn't tell us he was doing it, and deliberately accelerated the cancer, and I started rupturing and going septic very rapidly, and the cancer started metastasizing everywhere very rapidly. And that's when I sent an email to Sasha Minu Curry's mother, Lynn Curry, and I CC'd it to Chad and the NAACP and several people at Mizzou, suggesting that if the Mizzou football players went on strike against these Jim Crow policies, it would devastate the entire local economy, and that's what it's done. There's been a 35% drop in enrollment. They've closed 7 dorms, had to fire over 500 faculty members, forced over 200 more into early retirement. They're losing hundreds of millions of dollars a year because of that ongoing boycott. People are still watching my Facebook page, and they're still seeing that I'm being refused cancer treatment. They are not going to back down and make things right. So the boycott is ongoing. And that also resulted in, they weren't just harming me, they were harming me to hide what they were doing to their African American athletes, and they were in the top 10 in college football, and now they're being boycotted by the top athletes. They dropped to less than 25. They weren't even in the top 25. I think they just recently graduated to the top 22. So that is why the Democrats in New York are vehemently protecting the Democrats in Missouri. When that doctor deliberately accelerated this cancer, it was his post-surgical complications. It's Catholic Health's criminal liability. Now, why did he do that? He did that to cover up the sexual abuse by Beth Sweeney, where she got recorded coming into my room. Ooh, you're so fascinating. Maybe someday we can be friends. And I thought, I'm autistic. I'm thinking, is she trying to be friends? Is she trying to have sex? Is it friends with benefits? I really didn't know what was going on. All I knew that I was in miserable pain. The mass was rupturing and causing damage to the left kidney, and I was in so much pain I couldn't get out of bed. I lost my regular paying jobs that I had gotten to try to get a roof over my head. Nanette Ward, my advocate with Central Missouri Stop Human Trafficking Coalition, she had worked for Columbia Housing Authority, and she got me an emergency voucher as a trafficking victim to get me off the streets for my safety. It was important to my safety to get me off the streets, so they gave me an emergency housing voucher. So I eventually got housing, which after Beth threw her fit, about getting recorded coming in the exam room trying to have sex with me. In her head, this is how you have to think about it. Everybody thinks, ooh, a doctor trying to have sex with a patient? That's almost unheard of. Because number one, most of them, they're not interested in their patients. They're not looking at their patients like that. They're looking at their patients as just science, sort of like science experiments. It's, you're there, I gotta fix you, and they're not thinking that way. What you have to realize is Columbia, Missouri is a small college town. The University of Missouri is a big university, but that town in and of itself is really only around probably 70,000 people. And there's actually a book called Rebels on the Border by Aaron Astor, a Civil War scholar. He published a book called Rebels on the Border about the Little Dixie area of Missouri, and there's Little Dixie recreation area and lake there in Columbia, and it's called Little Dixie because it's run by the Ku Klux Klan. It's a southern state. It was a slave state. That book that Aaron Astor wrote was about the Little Dixie area of Missouri and the bluegrass area of Kentucky. And Rebels on the Border means they're refusing to emancipate and ratify with the laws against slavery. Within his first, I believe, I don't remember whether it was in his introduction or the first chapter, but the very beginning of the book, he says very openly that the state government, all of the state government offices in Jefferson City at the state capitol, is run by a group of white supremacists that operate out of a state university in Columbia that's 15 miles north. There's only one state university in Columbia. It's the University of Missouri, Mizzou. So that right there tells you that everything I'm saying is supported by nonfiction text by a specialist who specializes in that type of attitude. So, what Beth Sweeney and her husband, they're like a frat boy and sorority girl. The whole town, and pretty much everyone in the state, if you're anybody, you probably graduated from Mizzou, and they're very clannish, they're very cliquish, and they protect the university's reputation at all costs, but they still act like college kids. They go out, they get drunk, and they have a hookup culture, and they're hooking up within, they're still having sex with everybody. The husband was having sex with a lot of different people. She was having sex with a lot of different people. He was apparently frequenting the gay male prostitutes down at a porn shop, according to one of my witnesses, whom one of her patients tried to kill by slipping him drugs and sending him into a coma that still has him in a nursing facility after he spent a couple months in the ICU. And they go out and and because they're in bed with all of the oversight officials, like at the time I was there, it was Attorney General Chris Koster was a University of Missouri frat boy. Jay Nixon was an MU frat boy. It doesn't matter. Republican, Democrat doesn't matter. You can't tell the difference between the two parties pretty much these days. They do all of this on the news. They put on a show, making it look like they're at each other's throats, and but at the end of the day, they're protecting the top 1%, and they're protecting all of these fraud scams because they're all profiting from it. They all own stocks in all of this, and that's how it goes. So, basically, that's what Byron Brown and Cuomo were protecting. And I'll go into more about what they were protecting with Roswell, Kalida, and Catholic Health.